Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. Imagine a group so audacious it made tech giants and governments alike tremble, not with brute force, but through cunning ingenuity, persistence, and a talent for chaos. This is Lapsus, or classified by Microsoft as Strawberry Tempest, but I'm not using that name. Lapsus, when they were the most active, was an international attacker collective that's rewritten the playbook for cybercrime, forcing an industry to question their best practices, their sacred cows. From extorting billion-dollar companies to exposing government vulnerabilities, their attacks are as varied as they are effective. Social engineering, SIM swapping, multi-factor authentication fatigue, even targeting third-party suppliers. Once they breach a system, they dig deep into harvesting sensitive data and threatening to unleash it all if their demands aren't met. And yet, the faces behind the keyboards might surprise you. These aren't hardened cybercriminals tucked away in Eastern Europe or Russia or the depths of China, as the movies might suggest. No, these attackers had Western ties. At least two of the Lapsus members are teenagers, arrested in Brazil and the UK in 2022. But age didn't stop them from leveraging Telegram to recruit, communicate, and even boast about their exploits. On this episode of the Intrusions Indepth podcast, I analyze the origins, motives, and key figures behind the hacking group known as Lapsus. But first, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Lapsus, stylized with the dollar sign at the end. I'll be calling them Lapsus throughout this episode, burst onto the scene in late 2021 and quickly made headlines for their bold and unorthodox tactics and being toxic. They were very, very toxic, which shouldn't be a surprise since they were young males on the internet. And if you've ever played games online, kind of comes with the territory. They would routinely leave their calling cards of sorts, which was usually redirects to adult websites or pictures of male anatomy. It's much like Jonah Hill's character's obsession in the movie Superbad when he just couldn't stop drawing them in class. I'll let you look that up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The point I'm trying to make is that this is teenagers and young adults doing illegal stuff on the internet. What do you expect? Let's put our pearls down now. Unlike traditional hacker groups that often operate in the shadows, Lapsus was flamboyant and brazen, using platforms like Telegram to publicly taunt their victims and even recruit new members. As a note, Lapsus has had multiple names through different organizations, but I would argue that Lapsus is the most prevalent. Deb0537 is Microsoft's old name for the group, using their previous naming methodology. Strawberry Tempest is their new name under this new naming methodology that Microsoft uses. But what is particularly intriguing about Lapsus was the composition of its members, as well as its victims. Several household names. Many of the key members and perhaps the leader of Lapsus were minors when they committed these crimes. And Lapsus wasn't the first name of the group. According to one of the many articles Krebs on Security wrote about Lapsus, I'll link through to them. Researchers from security firms, Unit 221B and Palo Alto Networks, revealed that before launching Lapsus, the group's leader, known as White, also referred to as White Doxben and OLOC, was a founding member of a cybercriminal group called the Recursion Team. I've also seen this name being called the Infinite Recursion Team and other sourcing. Now, this earlier version of Lapsus had a nasty little trick, according to a post on crack.to, a popular forum where people solicit illegal acts. Life pro tip, it's probably infested with feds. They would compromise police accounts and then issue fake legal requests to companies for all sorts of information about individuals. Apple, Google, Snapchat, and just some of the services they listed in the ad. Now imagine all of your text messages, emails, direct messages, Google Drive, and any of those other accounts they could be linked to your phone. And they could have access to all of those accounts. This could be a real problem. This information also helped them pivot to their next trick, SIM swapping and swatting attacks. Now, these swatting attacks involve making fake bomb threats, hostage situations, and other violent scenarios to trick the police department into responding with potentially deadly force to a target's address. Now, the SIM swapping allows them to reset access to accounts and take them over. Now, this is troubling if you have a large amount of cryptocurrency on an online exchange. They could siphon that off, likely leading to large amounts of stolen money. And it appears that's exactly what they did. By some accounts, they had up to $14 million at one point in cryptocurrency. White or White Docspin had also been the owner of a website called Docspin, where you could find personal information about people or post information about them so you could dox them. But after assuming ownership of the platform, the community got mad because the user experience of the site went down, as well as some other things. In return, the community of Docspin users, people who use the data to harass people, turned their skill set loose on White Docspin himself, all the way up to taking photos outside of his house, reportedly. There's even reports of individuals asking if he could come out to play. This obviously led to concerns for his safety, which I'll elaborate more on in the future. Ultimately, Docspin was sold back to its original owner at a large discount, while White Docspin, or White, dumped the entire dataset on Telegram, thus making the people angry since some of the data was still private or in draft mode. Needless to say, no friendships were being made here. And these people are usually not the ones you want to make mad. I do find it a little ironic, though, that Docspin had been doxxed. Now, this earlier iteration of Lapsus had a website that has since been taken down, referring to the team, Infinite Recursion, or Recursion team, as, quote, "This team is made up of cyber enthusiasts who major in skills including security penetration testing, software development, and botting," end quote. Ultimately, this group disbanded near the end of 2021. Some of the members went dormant, either quitting their legal ways or perhaps using another handle, while others went on to form Lapsus. Now, this new group was focused on getting the attention the old group never received. To do this, they had some big targets in their crosshairs, which is exactly what I plan on talking about. However, I want to make sure I'm doing my public service announcement as well. Very few attackers walk away from committing crimes, especially those in Western societies where this sort of action is frowned upon and illegal. Lapsus is no different. While I may make jokes and sensationalize these actions, it's illegal and not a good career path long term, just in my opinion. Now, jumping forward, in 2022, arrests were made in both Brazil and the UK, United Kingdom, revealing that some key players were teenagers. The City of London's police department took into custody 7 individuals connected to the group, highlighting a new and unsettling trend in cybercrime demographics. Laws weren't really in place for highly destructive but non-violent aspects of crime carried out by minors. Furthermore, since most of these actions were conducted by minors, or allegedly conducted in some cases, details are sparse. Now, Lapsus's attacks occurred in 3 waves, similar to internet joyrides. So, much like the prosecutors did, I'm going to structure this episode as such. Oh, and Lapsus was prolific, to say the least. Some of their attacks I will get in the weeds in, while others I'll be providing a high-level overview. There's also other attacks that probably weren't reported or covered in media outlets, so obviously I don't have much to go on here.
Wave 1.
Now, in the early hours of December 10th, 2021, Brazilians woke up to some alarming news. The Ministry of Health's website was down, which honestly probably wouldn't be an issue, but it included Connect SUS, the platform that tracks every citizen's journey through the public healthcare system. Overnight, millions lost access to their digital COVID-19 vaccination certificates. These were the COVID times. Now, this wasn't a system glitch or scheduled maintenance gone wrong, normal things that take down government systems and inconvenience the taxpayers paying for said systems. No, it was Lapsus, because, well, otherwise this episode wouldn't make sense. They left a message on the defaced websites, quote, we have extracted 50 terabytes of data from your systems and deleted it from your servers. Contact us if you want the data returned. End quote. They didn't just claim to steal the data, they allegedly deleted it from the ministry's own servers. And this message included contact details to their Telegram server and a brazen taunt to the authorities. Now, the implications were immediate and far reaching. In the midst of a global pandemic and the rise of the Omicron variant, the attack crippled Brazil's ability to track vaccination status. International travelers faced uncertainty as the digital infrastructure supporting health declarations collapsed. Airline passengers were still able to move as they were on a different system, but movement inside the country, once they cleared customs, was hit or miss. In response, the health ministry swiftly addressed the nation, assuring that backups existed and efforts were underway to restore the systems. Meanwhile, the National Data Protection Authority, or ANPD, launched an investigation, coordinating with the Institutional Security Office and the federal police. Under Brazil's General Data Protection Regulations, the ministry was compelled to provide clarification, a process that would test the resiliency of the country's cybersecurity measures. Now, in response to this, President Bolsonaro, who already opposed the passports, changed the protocol to quarantine for 5 days and test for COVID upon arrival and release. There is also reporting that Lapsus got in at least 9 other agencies in Brazil, but targeted the Ministry of Health as they disagreed with this policy of digital vaccine passports as well. According to Andrea Peterson's reporting from 2022, from The Record, I'll link through to it, Lapsus infiltrated the Ministry of the Economy and the National Electric Energy Agency, among others. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Just months prior, the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, suffered an attack that disrupted mandatory health declarations for incoming travelers. This is the airline system. This event occurred shortly after the World Cup qualifier between Brazil and Argentina and was halted when Anvisa officials accused the Argentine players of violating COVID-19 protocols. They take soccer seriously, people. And let's not forget that in November of 2020, when over 16 million Brazilian COVID-19 patients had their personal and health data leaked online, when a hospital employee inadvertently uploaded a spreadsheet containing usernames and passwords and access keys to sensitive government systems and GitHub. Less than a week later, another breach exposed personal information of more than 243 million Brazilians, both living and deceased, because passwords were left in the source code of an official Ministry of Health website that was online for at least 6 months. So while there isn't a detailed explanation of how the Lapsus attackers got into the Ministry of Health systems, the recurring incidents paint a troubling picture of systemic vulnerabilities within the country and the infrastructure that they could have exploited to gain access. Also, it's worth noting that while this did garner some media attention, as it disrupted healthcare services and things that relied on that system, it didn't get the attention of the security community. Ransomware attacks happen all the time. Medical providers are not exempt from these arsonists. So just to delete the data lacked any real sophistication. Adding insult to injury, it doesn't appear that they made any money from this, and the ministry recovered after a week or so. Lapsus also hit some other Brazilian companies, a media company, car rentals, and they redirected their websites to adult sites. This is also when the Lapsus Telegram channel got highlighted in the media. But this wasn't the level of attention that Lapsus sought. To get that, they would need to attack companies based in the United States. Their first victim was Okta, an identity and access management company. One hallmark of the Lapsus attacks are that they targeted support teams for the organizations. Typically, support engineers have access to customer systems and repos like source code or other valuable information. Also, larger organizations will utilize third-party teams for a few economic reasons. First, most high-profile customers require follow-the-sun support or 24/7 support SLAs, or something along those lines. So this would require organizations to set up operations or abide by regulations for numerous countries with different holidays, cultures, wages, labor laws, etc., etc. One way to get around this is to hire in-place firms in various countries to act as support for that subset of customers. Second, This may be a lower cost to the company as well, since this is less full-time employees that are required to be kept on payroll, and may be able to utilize pools of lower cost talent. Now, I'm not advocating for this or against this practice or anything like that, to be clear. It doesn't really matter how I feel, as this is a reflection of the current landscape. I don't have a position on it, to be honest. Okta utilized this practice, and they may still utilize this practice. But on the Lapsus Telegram channel, 8 screenshots appeared claiming to show images captured from Okta's internal systems. According to security researchers, Lapsus was able to gain access to Okta chat messages in Slack, customer support tickets in Jira, along with some back-end system dubbed Superuser to assist in the helping of customers. Now, the group made it clear that it was not targeting Okta's systems, but rather their customers. Now, if you tie in reporting from the CSRB report, you'll find that company Slacks were a favorite target of the group. Now, this could be so they could download what I like to call the Slack tribal knowledge. This is the stuff that should be in wikis or documentation, but it arose from an internal question and thus got a very thought out and drawn out response. All the way to another tactic of impersonating other employees for social engineering escapades. One of which was posing as a help desk and encouraging employees to approve MFA prompts. As you can see, this isn't groundbreaking by any means, and that's not meant to be insulting. Years ago, I think security professionals, both offensive and defensive aligned individuals, would have dubbed these attacks as like script kiddies or lacking technical prowess, but you can't argue with the results. Okta CSO David Bradbury weighed in on the incident by stating that the incident was minor and didn't require corrective actions. A hired service provider found attackers accessed a support engineer's laptop for 5 days between January 6th and January 21st, 2022. However, the access didn't allow actions like creating or deleting users or downloading customer databases. Support engineers can reset passwords, including multi-factor authentication, but don't have access to those passwords once they are reset. Furthermore, Okta stated that this incident affected around 2.5% of their customers. However, some had criticisms of Okta because apparently they knew about this incident towards the end of January 2022, but didn't publicly acknowledge it until March. And for what it's worth, I think that criticism is a little unfair. Okta did go public in 2017. However, the mandatory reporting of security incidents from within 4 days was only recently finalized from the SEC, I think in like July of 2024, this year, which I have doubts on the constitutionality of this rule from the SEC in light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling on Looper Bright. This is the case that got rid of Chevron deference. I'm not trying to get in the weeds here, but Chevron deference is a 40-year-old doctrine generally permitting administrative agencies to interpret statutes implicitly rather than explicitly, allowing them to substitute their own interpretations for reasonable ones, avoiding the need for courts to make the decision. The issue was that reasonable isn't a measurable term and left a lot of leeway for agencies to have a lot of power. The ATF, EPA, etc., to influence the economy and limit rights of individuals based off rules made by unelected bureaucrats instead of laws made by lawmakers. Then, given the only way these organizations that regulate grow is by making more regulations, the goalpost for reasonable moves over the years. Now, in an effort to be fair, advocates for Chevron argue that courts are slow as it is and judges aren't experts, so they should be allowed to rely on the experts in the field to interpret vague laws. Also, judges aren't typically elected, so it's not like they can be held accountable for getting it wrong as well. But that's an exception because sometimes there are elected judges. So with that being said, I'm not sure the SEC rules stand up if challenged, despite how well-intentioned they may be. Legally speaking, I don't see Okta having an obligation to disclose it, as many other companies also don't acknowledge incidents either, from what I can tell at least. And there needs to be some acknowledgement that not all security incidents are created equally. If the supply chain is breached, a new update is pushed out, malware to all of your customers, then we need some disclosure there. And it should be urgent and evolving as more details are made. Not just customers, but customers of customers as well. I would imagine that this was the fear with Okta, as they are on FedRAMP systems and used everywhere in important places. But as details emerged, it appeared that these hackers had limited access to a small subset of customers, the 2.5, like I said earlier. Now, I think Okta could have communicated this better and earlier, but I also want to acknowledge that it takes time to do these investigations, to cross your T's and dot your I's. Giving out false information or misleading information can be just as damaging. But let's go further. Let's say it's one computer that's infected with commodity malware from a shady website. EDR catches the incident, no customer data or company data is leaked. The laptop is re-imaged, investigations across the org show no evidence of spreading. Is that worth sharing to the SEC? Does this warrant a blog post for disclosure? I lean towards no. Let's say you're in Paris taking a workcation, doing your AI-generated presentation for your board while having a baguette and cheese and French wine. You're also wearing a beret. Maybe some of these like credit card, Apple Intelligence, Microsoft Copilot commercials are seeping into my subconscious here. Anyway, you're living your best life and someone runs up to your outdoor table and steals your laptop. Now they're also in a beret with a black and white striped shirt on. They don't say anything when they do it because they're also a mime. Now you pull out your phone, Slack your InfoSec team and your manager saying your laptop has been liberated. The InfoSec team runs some Jamf commands and wipes the device. Now, besides you not having a laptop, no harm has really been done here. You get a police report. The French police make jokes about how it's very hard to question mimes, and everyone moves on. Or, I don't know, you hit it off with the cop, and it turns into a rom-com called Silent Theft, Loud Hearts. Now, should that be an SEC filing? I lean towards no. Now, back to Okta. There aren't many details on how these attackers targeted this individual or what they used to get access. There are multiple reports of Lapsus using a piece of malware called the Redline Stealer or Redline Password Stealer. So maybe that was the avenue, or they just purchased access. Now, Redline is one of these as-a-service malware packages. On some of the underground forums, it's being sold for a subscription of $100 US a month, or $500 for a lifetime light version. The leader of Lapsus was also doxxed on DocSpin after this attack, which probably helped law enforcement make their first arrest. The leader of Lapsus and an unnamed 16-year-old accomplice was apprehended for the attacks on Okta and the Brazilian agencies, as well as an attack on BTEE, Brazilian Telecom and the mobile arm Everything Everywhere, a UK-based telecommunications company. Now, it turns out the leader of Lapsus and a minor accomplice had infiltrated the networks of the telecommunications provider, did some SIM swapping, and drained the accounts of people who used their phones as MFA for their cryptocurrency exchange. This was all alleged by the prosecutors and the company. Now, despite pleading guilty to some of the charges, the duo was ultimately released pending investigation. Now, what this likely means is that they didn't believe they had enough information to prosecute them further. As the group, like many attackers, did most of their dirty work on virtual private servers. The authorities likely didn't have access to those. And these can be an issue for multiple reasons. These servers can be purchased using cryptocurrencies in some instances, so the owner's identity isn't always clear. Even if law enforcement can convince the owners of the site to play nice, which is also a point of contention as these servers aren't always in Western-friendly nations, or nations or countries that respect warrants from outside government. It's all very hard. Plus, it all moves at the speed of government. Needless to say, though, after being arrested, the group learned from their troubled ways, they packed it all up, and they rode off into the sunset. I'm kidding. They pwned the video.
Wave 2.
Likely feeling empowered from walking out of the police station, Lapsus went on. Now, Wave 2 of this internet joyride was by far the most prolific. Some of the biggest businesses on the planet were taunted and pillaged by these young attackers. Starting with NVIDIA. In some ways, the Lapsus attack on NVIDIA is, well, I'm kind of at a loss for words to describe it. It's a ransom attack, not ransomware. I'll explain that. As well as being ideologically motivated and seems to have something like bullying behavior as well as good old fashioned hackbacking. Now, this attack is what made me and many others start to follow Lapsus as something different. In early 2022, a key player in the artificial intelligence and gaming sector became the target of one of the most presumptuous attacks at the time, NVIDIA, the company behind GPU technology and 120% returns on equity, fell victim to the hacking group. This wasn't just a technical breach. It was more of a game of cat and mouse with source code, ransoms, and ultimatums. It's good stuff. If you're an outside observer to this like I was, it probably sucked pretty hard if you were any of the parties involved. But here's what happened. In February 2022, NVIDIA confirmed that it had been attacked, with the attackers claiming to have stolen over 1 terabyte, that's with a T, of sensitive data. Now, what's fascinating about this attack is how quickly things escalated. Lapsus didn't just demand a ransom for this information to not be released, classic hack and dump. No, they made a public spectacle of it. They claimed to have obtained sensitive information, including employee credentials and proprietary source code for NVIDIA's GPU drivers. But it didn't stop there. The group issued a weird ultimatum. This one was ideologically driven. They demanded that NVIDIA make their GPU drivers open source and remove the controversial hash rate limiter, or sometimes called the LHR, light hash rate limiter, a feature that limits cryptocurrency mining efficiency on certain graphics cards. Now, if NVIDIA didn't comply, Lapsus threatened to release the stolen data. Now, for NVIDIA, this attack wasn't a technical challenge. The attackers weren't asking them to do something they couldn't do. It's not like they hacked SpaceX and was like, hey, land a rocket on Venus or else. And in response, Elon's like, hey, man, we're trying. Obviously, NVIDIA could open source their software whenever they wanted. I think their shareholders would hate that. Their employees and executives paid in stock would probably hate that too, and not be too keen to it. Also, the United States government and other Five Eyes nations or anyone geopolitically opposed to China wouldn't be a fan of this either. There are sanctions in place to prevent China from getting these advanced chips. All of this is to say that in the great AI race, NVIDIA is a key player. Instead, this was a direct assault on their business strategy. The hash rate limiter was a deliberate move to ensure that gamers, not crypto miners, could access GPUs during a global chip shortage. Sorta. I'm going to try and give you both sides of the argument. NVIDIA introduced the light hash rate limiter to curb the cryptocurrency mining capabilities of some of its graphics cards, specifically the GeForce RTX 30 series graphic cards. Now, the goal was to ensure that more GPUs were available for gamers, as they were the most vocal during the shortage, and the gaming industry was sort of dependent on NVIDIA chips for all their games that pushed the experience graphically. However, this move sparked significant controversy and debate. The purpose was to reduce the efficiency of GPUs and mining Ethereum, the most popular cryptocurrency for GPU mining. NVIDIA aimed to deter the miners from purchasing large quantities of gamer GPUs. This was intended to alleviate the supply constraints and lower the inflated pricing of GPUs at the time, making GPUs more accessible to gamers. But the limiter's effectiveness was quickly undermined. In 2021, prior to this attack, by the way, NVIDIA accidentally released a beta driver that disabled the limiter, restoring full mining performance to the GTX 3060 cards. Now, this blunder highlighted potential weaknesses in the limiter's implementation. And of course, there was the hacker community as well. Over time, various groups and individuals developed methods to bypass the LHR restrictions. By May of 2022, mining software like NiceHash's QuickMiner had fully unlocked the LHR limitation, allowing GTX 30 series GPUs to mine at their original unrestricted hash rates. Now, critics argued that the LHR limiter was a superficial solution that failed to address the underlying issues of supply and demand. The ongoing shortage of GPUs meant that the miners continued to purchase available stock, regardless of the LHR restriction. Furthermore, there's also arguments that non-LHR GPUs were more expensive and faced heavy markups, both by suppliers and third-party sellers of secondhand GPUs. Now, this sparked some alternative theories online that the United States federal government or some governments made NVIDIA do this as part of some assault on cryptocurrency, or something along those lines. Those theories aren't all that fleshed out, to be honest. It was sort of a general sentiment online, which, to be fair, isn't all that far off considering the campaign waged against David Marcus and the Meta Facebook Libra project. Quote, a letter written by U.S. senators to Libra Association participants Visa, MasterCard, and Stripe highlighted a section that said that these companies could expect a high level of regulatory scrutiny on all payment activities. Quote, Facebook appears to want the benefits of engaging in financial activities without the responsibility of being regulated as a financial services company. Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat, Ohio, and Senator Brian Schatz, Democrat, Hawaii, wrote, end quote. I mean, this is U.S. senators from the government threatening pain to the Facebook-backed coin and any organization that wants to help it get off the ground. Why, you ask? Well, the generous answer is that they don't want people to be taken advantage of. Now, the least generous answer is probably in the form of cryptocurrencies are a threat to the US dollar, the banking industry, and anyone that gets a slice of the pie when purchases are made peer-to-peer. We also need to remember that during this time, everyone hated Facebook, or Meta. The United States left hated Facebook because they said Cambridge Analytica had somehow used data science forecasting to predict what people were going to do based on models from Facebook likes or something along those lines. And the United States right, on the other hand, hated Facebook for censoring posts of conservatives and conservative media personalities. Both sides figured Facebook probably had too much power, and no one was in a hurry to give them more. So like I said, these theories aren't out of the blue. Now, they may be way off base in regards to NVIDIA in this instance, but there's documented examples at least. Now, fast forward to October 2022. This is months after the Lapsus attack. NVIDIA began removing the LHR restrictions from its GPUs. The company cited changes in the cryptocurrency landscape, such as Ethereum's shift to a proof-of-stake model, which reduced the demand for GPU mining as reasons for the removal. An NVIDIA spokesperson simply stated, quote, we don't believe it's necessary in the current environment, end quote. Now, the removal of this limiter coincided with the oversupply of GTX 30 series GPUs. This surplus was partially due to decreased demand from miners and the release of the new RTX 40 series cards. The decision to eliminate the limiter as seen by some as a strategy to boost sales of existing inventory, which makes sense, because they would want to get rid of these cards, I would imagine. So at the time, analysts and people on the internet said complying with Lapsus's demands would have upended this strategy and opened the door to even more chaos in the GPU market. Others argue that NVIDIA's LHR was a poor attempt to address the problem, while also an attempt to maximize profits, which ultimately is probably a mixture of both. So how did Lapsus pull this off? Like their other attacks, this breach likely involved a mix of social engineering and exploiting system vulnerabilities. There isn't clear reporting on exactly how Lapsus got into NVIDIA, but the general consensus is that they social engineered someone. And this is in line with what they've done in the past, and what they're going to do in the future. Spoiler alert. Or perhaps they bought access from an underground forum, from an access broker of sorts. From there, reports suggest that they gained access to NVIDIA's employee credentials, which probably allowed them to move laterally within the company's network. This is Cyber Kill Chain 101 stuff here. But the sheer scale of the data exfiltration, over 1 terabyte, shows just how deeply they penetrated NVIDIA systems and how long they were there for. Similar to my Phineas Fisher episode on Hacking Team, shameless plug, the attackers were able to move and take what they wanted without fear of detection from the security team. And this isn't throwing shade at NVIDIA's team. This company is massive, and stolen credentials detection can be difficult to detect. If they were bouncing around with VPN connections, this can be hard to see. And as I'm about to discuss, NVIDIA did utilize MDM, mobile device management, for access to their internal VPN. So it's not like they didn't have any controls. But here's where the story takes a turn. NVIDIA fought back, allegedly. I don't want to get sued if these reporters I use in here are lying. But technically speaking, this is a crime. And I don't support hacking back, for the record. I think there's more harm than good that comes from it. I would rather the spooks from the government do the offensive actions. They are going to be the ones fighting in the wars if things get heated. Now, according to reports, the company retaliated by hacking Lapsus' own systems, encrypting the stolen data to render it useless. According to reporting from Michael Novenson of CRN, I'll link through to the article, and some others I've used, quote, Lapsus said on Telegram that accessing the VPN of NVIDIA employees requires a PC to be enrolled in a mobile device management, MDM, according to screenshots posted on Twitter. For this reason, NVIDIA was able to connect to a virtual machine that Lapsus used, according to the ransomware operators. End quote. Now, Lapsus also had a few choice remarks that we could call rich, all things considered. Quote, everyone, NVIDIA are criminals. Some day ago, attack against NVIDIA and stole 1 terabyte of confidential data. The Lapsus operator posted on their public Telegram channel. Quote, today, woke up and found NVIDIA scum had attacked the machine with ransomware. End quote. They then followed it with, quote, luckily it had a backup, but why are they think they can connect to a private machine and install ransomware? End quote. Like I said, this is pretty rich. This counterattack is unusual in the cybersecurity world, where most companies focus on damage control rather than going on the offensive. Although Sophos did step things up, in my opinion, with the Pacific Rim report dropping implants on the devices of Chinese bug hunters. And look, when the United States and other governments start dropping requirements for exploit-free software or something similar, these companies have to get creative in how they meet that objective. So let's talk about the fallout. Lapsus did manage to leak some of the stolen data, but the 1 terabyte dump never came. NVIDIA was likely able to nuke most of the files, but in retaliation, Lapsus did leak the credentials for over 70,000 employees. But NVIDIA was only the beginning. They went on to attack Samsung. Recently, I was asked to consult on a creative project around a fictional threat actor in a book being authored right now. I really enjoyed helping bridge the gap between tech concepts and creative execution. If you're working on a project and need fresh ideas, strategic input, or someone to help you wrap your head around what the quote-unquote hacking is, I'm here to help you. I've included a forum on my website, intrusionsindepth.com, under the Collaborations tab to get started. As Larry Page put it, small groups of people have a really huge impact. Now back to the show. Lapsus claimed to have stolen around 190 gigabytes of data from Samsung. Now, the types of data stolen included source code for Samsung's Trust Zone environment used for secure operations, algorithms for the biometric unlock operations of the Galaxy devices, a bootloader and some source code for recent Samsung devices, source code for Samsung's activation servers, source code for Samsung's account authentication APIs, and other related services, and confidential source code given to the chip designer at Qualcomm. Now, Lapsus was seen online as a sort of Robin Hood, a new anonymous type hacker group, and people were praising them in some circles. And days later, Ubisoft and T-Mobile reported breaches. For T-Mobile, the group attempted to SIM swap accounts linked to the FBI and Department of Defense here in the United States. That's a bold move. However, it appears that they failed due to other security checks in place. Now, Ubisoft has perhaps the least amount of details. Ubisoft confirmed that a cybersecurity incident had occurred, but specified no player personal information was accessed or exposed. And Lapsus must not have been overly impressed with this haul from Ubisoft, as it wasn't broadcast all over their Telegram channels. Moving on, Mercado Libre, an e-commerce platform, was also an alleged victim of Lapsus. Source code was stolen as well as user data from over 300,000 users. Mercado Libre stated that while the data was accessed, there was no evidence, according to their internal analysis, that any passwords, account balances, investments, financial information, or credit card information was obtained. Then, Vodafone, another large British telecom, said that they were attacked by the hacking group. They allegedly stole approximately 200 gigabytes of source code files, which they claimed were contained in around 5,000 GitHub repositories. This source code did not include customer data, but was proprietary to Vodafone's operations. This information was based on claims made by Lapsus themselves through their Telegram channel, where they conducted polls on which data to leak next. Vodafone confirmed that they were investigating these claims in collaboration with law enforcement, but could not comment on the credibility of the claims at the time. Then there was Globant, a Luxembourg-based IT company. Like Okta, they have access into some of the world's largest organizations, like Apple, DHL, and Citibank. Lapsus posted screenshots on their Telegram channel and claimed to have 70 gigabytes of data in the form of SQL database files and the credentials for the company's Jira, GitHub, and Confluence instances. Globant confirmed that it had been breached by the hacking group, but wasn't too forthcoming with details after that. As a result, their stock price fell 10% that day. But rest assured, this is the cybersecurity industry after all, so it quickly recovered. So this internet joyride, up until this point, was all rainbows and unicorns for the members of Lapsus. But they had made a mistake. A big mistake. A few days prior to the attack on Globant, they attacked Microsoft. Then they thought they were going to attack Microsoft and walk away unscathed. On March 20th, 2022, Microsoft was breached by Lapsus. And while I feel like I talk a lot about Microsoft's shortcomings, which to be honest, I think is apparent because of their importance within the industry, they did a great job with disclosure and notification with Lapsus, in my opinion, which I doubt they care about. Oh, and I'm a big fan of Microsoft's threat intelligence team. They put out some great work. The day after, or maybe less than that, Microsoft put out a preliminary blog post outlining the breach and what they knew. Microsoft confirmed that one of their employees' accounts had been compromised by the threat group, and it provided limited access to some source code repositories. In total, 37 gigabytes of data had been stolen. Source code for projects like Bing, Cortana, and Bing Maps, which I guess I just doubled the number of people who knew about that existing, and various other internal Microsoft projects. Furthermore, Microsoft made a point to specify that no customer data or customer code was involved in the observed activities. The Microsoft response teams engaged quickly to remediate the compromised account. Microsoft didn't share how the account was compromised either, but they did provide a general overview of the Lapsus crew's TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Essentially, the group's primary focus was obtaining compromised credentials for initial access to corporate networks of their victims. This could be through the use of the redline password stealers to obtain credentials or session tokens, purchasing credentials from criminal forums or access brokers, or even paying employees for access and MFA approval, or searching public repos for exposed credentials. But once they gained access to a network, the threat actors utilized AD Explorer to find privileged accounts. From there, they migrated to the development environment and collaboration platform. These are applications like Slack, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, Confluence, and Jira. And just if you're not tracking, development environments are like platforms like GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps. These are Git repos that companies use to store source code. Microsoft then outlines how the team has also been known to exploit vulnerabilities found in Confluence, Jira, and GitLab. So while not technically sophisticated, as in they aren't reversing these patches or finding these bugs themselves, it's broad and demonstrates a wide array of tactics to get access. Now, once the threat actors are able to harvest the valuable data, they will exfiltrate it over NordVPN connection. This allows them to hide their locations, giving law enforcement and just general investigators another thread to pull. Oh, and most of this came from a blog post from the bad Microsoft intelligence team. I've linked through to it, where they dismantled the group's TTPs. I would also bet that the Microsoft threat intelligence team was all over DocSpend and knew who the leader of Lapsus was. But if that wasn't enough, Microsoft used the ultimate flex. The day after, on 21 March 2022, Lapsus appeared on the FBI's most wanted list. The FBI was probably aware of DocSpin and the doxing the leader of Lapsus had gotten as well. Now, the FBI didn't announce that Microsoft had asked them for this warrant or anything like that. This is just my opinion. In case you live under a rock, Microsoft is a major player in tech, the economy, and more importantly, in government systems. So, yes, while you may get into their massive networks of systems, you probably aren't going to walk away from this unscathed. Because of the reliance on Microsoft systems for the government of the United States, other countries, the US economy, etc., government officials see Microsoft as a national security interest, to say the least, and thus attacks on them are seen as attacks on national security in some cases. Coupled with, if you're not in a country that's going to shield you, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, a handful of other countries, things are going to get real for you in a hurry. And this heat probably spooked the leader of Lapsus, as he was offering money to the members of DocSpin to take down his information. Obviously, though, this is the internet, so the damage was already done. On 24 March 2022, UK police had arrested 7 people for their involvement with the hacking group, ranging from ages 15 to 21. But the Telegram channel was still active. Not everyone had been caught. On 30 March 2022, almost a week after the previous arrest, Lapsus started posting on the Telegram channel that they had attacked Global, the IT company that I just talked about. And that was the last post from the group on the Telegram channel. The suspected leader of Lapsus and a 17-year-old accomplice was arrested on 31 March 2022, and since they were now 17, they were facing a metric butt-ton of charges under the Computer Misuse Act. This is the UK's version of the Cyber Fraud and Abuse Act, the CFAA, here in the United States. Oh, and it's a metric butt-ton because it's the metric system, obviously. But in layman's terms, got real.
Wave 3.
Now, luckily for the leader of Lapsus, he got out on bail a day later for some amount of money that isn't public. As part of the release order, he faced a month-long internet suspension. Now, most of the time, while you're pending trial or recently accused of a crime, it's a good idea to avoid committing more crimes and violating those court orders while you're at it. But hey, your mileage may vary. Now, most of the trial records and case details are secret, as this is a minor, but his primary defense was that he was unfit to stand trial because of mental health conditions that he had been diagnosed with before. More on this in a bit. But for some reason or another, probably as a way to avoid the harassment from being doxxed and the constant supply of reporters being annoying, the leader of Lapsus was moved to a hotel. There, he got his hands on an Amazon Fire Stick and a keyboard. Once he plugged the device into a hotel TV, he got busy working on his last set of victims. This time, the target was Uber, the ride-sharing, food delivery, and MFL commercial psyop to get more people hungry. According to Uber's statement, this attack began with a social engineering onslaught targeting an employee. The attackers reportedly sent repeated two-factor authentication requests to the employee until they finally accepted one. Once inside, Lapsus moved quickly, gaining access to Uber's internal systems, including their Slack, their AWS accounts, and Google Workspace accounts. Slack, in particular, became ground zero for the attackers' antics. Lapsus brazenly posted a message in Uber's company-wide channel declaring their successful breach. Now imagine logging into your workplace Slack and seeing the attacker gloating about how they infiltrated your systems. Brutal. Uber confirmed that no user data, like trip details or credit card numbers, had been stolen, but the attackers had accessed sensitive company information, including financial data and internal reports. For Uber's security team, this was a scramble to contain the fallout. But the silver lining to this was that the SOC team didn't have to triage or determine if they had been breached. Much like having all of your data leaked online one morning, having Slack messages taunt you the whole time is a pretty good indicator of compromise. Now let's talk about Lapsus's methods. Instead of exploiting systems, they relied on exploiting human vulnerabilities. The key technique, in this case, fatigue. By spamming two-factor authentication requests, they wore down the target employee or the external contractor until they inadvertently just gave in or they gave up. And I have some opinions on this in a bit. But the fallout was immediate. Uber launched a full investigation working with the FBI, among others, to trace the breach. And when the dust settled, Uber confirmed that the attackers did get access to some data, but it didn't appear to be material. And I know Uber gets some criticism sometimes because of the whole unauthorized bug bounty or bug bounty after the fact incident, but their response to this incident was transparent and exemplified brevity. They didn't spend the first 3 paragraphs novel-gazing about why an attacker would attack them, or trying to play the victim, or saying this was a, quote, well-funded or well-resourced attack, or trying to CYA themselves. It's 2024, almost 2025. As we can see, everyone from nation-states to APTeens are targeting these organizations. Some for intel, some for the lulz, some because they're ransomware arsonists. The point I'm trying to make is that no one is really surprised anymore when a company gets breached. They are usually surprised when they hear about how much of their user data was stolen because the companies overcollect it for their analytics and underprotect it. But that's a whole nother discussion. Uber, for their part, addressed this incident, what they do, and answered the concerns of their customers. Here's some excerpts. Quote, "While our investigation and response efforts are ongoing, here is a further update on yesterday's incident. We have no evidence that the incident involved access to sensitive user data, like trip history. All of our services, including Uber, Uber Eats, Uber Freights, and Uber Driver apps, are all operational. As we shared yesterday, we have notified law enforcement. Internal software tools that we took down as a precaution yesterday are coming back online this morning." And another post, quote, "The attacker accessed several internal systems, and our investigation has focused on determining whether there was any material impact. While the investigation is still ongoing, we do have some details on our current findings that we can share. First and foremost, we have not seen the attacker access the production, i.e., public-facing systems that power our applications. Any user accounts or databases we use to store sensitive user information, like credit card numbers, user bank account info, or trip history. We also encrypt credit card information and personal health data, offering a further layer of protection. We've reviewed our code base and not found that the attacker made any changes. We also have not found that the attacker accessed any customer or user data stored in our cloud provider. It does appear that the attacker downloaded some internal Slack messages, as well as accessed or downloaded information from an internal tool our finance team uses to manage some invoices. We are currently analyzing those downloads. The attacker was able to access our dashboard at HackerOne, where security researchers report bugs and vulnerabilities. However, any bug reports that the hacker was able to access has been remediated. Throughout, we were able to keep all public-facing Uber, Uber Eats, Uber Freight services operational and running smoothly. Because we took down some internal tools, customer support operations were minimally impacted and are now back to normal." End quote. So all in all, this appears to be annoying for sure and wasteful, as Uber had to devote resources to forensicate and investigate this. But material impact, like some remediated HackerOne reports on bugs or minor business disruptions and some Slack trolling, I think most companies would take that as a W. Now, the leader of Lapsus reached out to security researchers asking for publicity, as the Telegram channel had been inactive since the Globalent attack, likely because his computer was taken by the authorities. Not having the Telegram channel made it difficult for him to get the attention. A day later, he moved on to the most famous Lapsus attack, the GTA hack of Rockstar Games. In September 2022, the gaming world felt the repercussions of the Lapsus gang. And this incident felt like it was ripped straight from the pages of Grand Theft Auto. I'm kidding. GTA is way more toxic and morally bankrupt than the Lapsus attacks. I just needed a tie-in. Rockstar Games had been breached in an apparent social engineering attack in which they tricked an employee for access. And what came next was a leak that sent shockwaves through the gaming industry. 90 videos of in-development footage for the highly anticipated Grand Theft Auto 6. Posting under the moniker Teapot Uber Hacker on Telegram and later a 4chan post and a GTA fan site, the individual started by posting short clips of developmental footage of the game. They also released some source code for GTA 5 and some source code for GTA 6. Now, leaks are nothing new in the gaming world, but this one hit differently. The footage surfaced showing early builds of GTA 6, complete with placeholder graphics, debug menus, and unfinished animations. For fans, it was an exciting, albeit unauthorized glimpse into Rockstar's creative process. For Rockstar, it could have ruined the release of a cash cow for the organization. At least that was Rockstar's take on it. The game footage isn't that big of a deal in my opinion, as it may ruin some of the marketing, but you usually buy games to play them. So while this may take some of the buzz out of the marketing campaign when it launches, this game is large enough that people who were going to buy the game or were on the fence wouldn't know when it was released. The source code, on the other hand, could lead to bigger issues, especially in the development of exploits, cheats, etc. And that could be a bigger headache for the company to deal with. Rockstar quickly confirmed the breach, assuring fans that the game's development would continue as planned. There weren't many more official details released by Rockstar. As it appears, most of the internal rumblings came from insiders of the company talking to reporters unauthorized. I don't want to get too deep into these accounts, as who knows if they're true, and honestly, I think we can all kind of assume how Rockstar felt. Having their work stolen, early footage of their product in a half-baked capacity leaked on the internet, and having to negotiate with the attackers via their internal Slack, it's probably safe to say they're going through a range of emotion. Now, let's take a moment to talk about how this breach highlights the vulnerabilities in cybersecurity. In this case, Lapsus reportedly used phishing tactics to trick their way onto the Slack workspace. This attack wasn't about brute forcing passwords or exploiting security vulnerabilities. It was about those humans. And that's the hard part. I'm going to talk about this more in a moment, but attacks like this was a wake-up call for many organizations. Annual cybersecurity training and hoping that employees do the right thing isn't enough for a modern security program. No matter how robust your security systems are, the human element remains the weakest link, followed quickly by your Fortinet edge device. Sorry, I've been burned by a lot of Fortinet. But one wrong click, one misplaced credential, and the source code can be opened. The quote-unquote basics go a long way here. Phishing-resistant MFA, role-based access, visual confirmations for account changes, resets and monitoring what's going on in your network infrastructure. It's not easy by any means, but it can be more barriers to make the compromise harder. But this is one of the issues organizations of any size have with security teams. How much is that team worth to the business? Let's say you own a cookie factory with your friends in a tree, like a treehouse bakery of sort, and you're an elf, just to make things fun. Well, there's a rival pirate cookie maker shop that wants your recipes. If they use their high-tech hacking and get them, you may be asking, why do we even pay this security team? The pirates got the recipes. And since you're one of the only elves who knows how to use spreadsheets, you see how this team generates no profit and is an overall drain on the company's resources. On the other hand, cookie operations run smooth, there's no hiccups in your business, and you're making record profits. However, once again, since you know how to use spreadsheets, you start looking for ways to optimize. Maybe we don't need this expensive SIM license. Let's use something free. Maybe we don't need these 5 security elves. Let's use 4. Maybe we could make more cookies if our employees didn't have to use our computers. They could use theirs, which were much faster, and assuming you have to use computers to make cookies. And this is where things start to slip. And I know undoubtedly that some of you are like, quote, why should a cookie company have to focus on security anyway? Their job is to make cookies. And I sympathize with that and agree with you in principle. But we have to live in the world as it is, not how we want it to be. Real politic, if you will. And people are going to attack you if you have a network. Now back to Rockstar. Shortly after posting the messages on Rockstar's internal Slack channel, In September of 2022, London authorities busted in the hotel room, catching the leader of Lapsus, confiscating his makeshift computer and an iPhone Max 13, the same model of phone used to authenticate to the Rockstar accounts. For violating the conditions of bail, he was sent back to jail. Yet the damage was already done. Rockstar reportedly paid $3.5 million to remediate this attack. As a note, GTA 6 is reported to cost somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion to make, and some estimate that the game could cross the $10 billion mark, possibly making $1 billion in the first 24 hours based on demands from the clips published online from the developers. Now, I don't play a lot of video games, so I'm kind of basing this off of what I've read. I'm not Rockstar's ideal customer. So at the end of the day, these appear to be more of an annoyance than true damage to the franchise, game, or even company. Up until this point, I have just used the leader of Lapsus title for the leader, as this was all carried out by minors. I'll elaborate on my logic in doing this in a moment. But in this section, I've decided I would just use the leader of Lapsus's name, Arion Kirchow, as it has been exposed in court documents and official record. Also, his handle in some of these was just plainly Arion. Not the best OPSEC, you could say. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's like 4D chest or something. But since they were a minor, I didn't really want to put their name on blast throughout the entire episode. Now, Arion and the other 17-year-old were facing 12 charges under the Computer Misuse Act. Arion was ultimately found guilty by a jury for all 12, while the defense was successful in proving that the other 17-year-old could only be found responsible for 3 of the 12 charges. But there was a slight hiccup in the criminal justice process. You see, Arion had been diagnosed as being autistic, ADHD, and other conditions. The other 17-year-old was also diagnosed as being on the spectrum as well. Now, Arion had been found guilty on all 12 charges placed against him by a jury, but was found unfit to stand trial by a judge as he lacked criminal intent by virtue of his medical conditions. Without criminal intent, he was only able to serve community service or be placed in a psychiatric care facility instead of a jail. So let's digest that a bit. Lapsus had caused millions in damage and proved over and over again that if they were exposed to the internet, they would continue their joyrides for influence. So this forced the judge's hand in December of 2023. Arion was sentenced to indefinite detention in a secure psychiatric facility after being found unfit to stand trial, thus closing the chapter of Lapsus. Now let's go back and take a look at some of the timeline that we do know about the alleged leader of Lapsus, Arion, leading up to this. Now it appears that Arion got his start in hacking games, specifically Minecraft. I've said this before in previous episodes, but game hackers and the bugs that they find are very impressive. It's a really good breeding ground for these skill sets. Arion was initially interested in ways to cheat in Minecraft games, recycling bugs that he found online in game forums to servers that had not been patched. Then graduated to finding his own bugs and using those. This is possibly why he took interest in those HackerOne reports from Uber. After being denied from a bug bounty, Arion moved on to learning website and web application exploitation, culminating in a website defacement of a NASA website. There were other attackers involved in that attack, and Arion's handle was one of the many. The motive here appears to be for the lulz, as well as bragging rights. It's also worth noting that some of the other handles had been linked to other high-profile breaches at the time. Lapsus did have a positive change, though, in information security, at least in my opinion. In information security or cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, there's a saying of sorts that criminals, attackers, etc. follow the way of least resistance when exploiting their targets. From my experience, I've seen these tactics follow a sort of cyclical rhythm of sorts. What's old is new again, after all, or the quote from Mark Twain or something attributed to that goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Once again, I don't know if that's Mark Twain. I guess there's controversy around it. I don't know. I'm just trying to use the point. Now, the exploitation of edge devices is becoming a thing again. We have silly bugs like /file system movement, and social engineering is cool again as well. Kevin Mitnick would be proud. RIP. Anecdotally speaking, these Lapsus attacks and similar attacks from other groups spurred the adoption of MFA and, well, more robust MFA. For the longest time, security professionals would grab their artisanal espresso with their pinky up and respond to every instance of stolen identity or weak passwords with, quote, should have just used MFA. Then that would have been the silver bullet to answer all these issues. In some ways, they were right. Some of the dumb ways that attackers were getting in could have been mitigated with MFA, multi-factor authentication. I'm going to be better about trying to spell things out with these acronyms. Now, password reuse is a problem in the age of password dump sites and data breaches of large companies. Just like these ransomware arsonists have greatly strengthened backup and recovery plans, Lapsus spurred the adoption of MFA and more resilient types of MFA. I mean, multi-factor authentication. That's a mouthful. I'm calling it MFA. Just as a quick refresher for MFA, authentication is roughly broken down into three methods. Something you know, knowledge, such as a password or a PIN. Something you have, a possession, such as a badge or a smartphone app. Coming back to this is where I want to focus. And something you are, such as biometric, like fingerprints or voice recognition, retina scans. So when people say MFA, they're talking about two or more of those. And this is why, as a matter of preference, I don't think sending an email code should count as a second form, because that could be only secured by one form of authentication. Sometimes it's the best you can do. But from my experience, this is usually the way MFA, in quotes, is bypassed. There's many other ways too, as Lapsus pointed out, and they are all used against victims. I'm trying to stay broad here. And I know you could make the argument that phones are only authenticated with one source as well, either PIN or biometric. And that is true. There are other safeguards in place, like Apple's new feature, Inactivity Reboot. In iOS 18, Apple appears to have added an undocumented security feature that reboots the device if it's not used for 72 hours. This has implications for anyone trying to maintain access to a stolen or lawfully seized iOS device without a valid passcode. I can only imagine that's going to be more FBI lawsuits incoming. There's older features as well on phones, like wiping the phone after so many failed attempts. Plus, unless you're like Ethan Hawke or like Ving Rhames from Mission Impossible, I forgot like the character's name, biometric spoofing isn't trivial. And going back to the phones, early MFA looked like automated text messages or calls to a cell phone as a way to utilize multi-factor authentication. And this worked okay as long as the attacker wasn't overly persistent and you weren't SIM swapped, which is surprisingly easy if you have access to the telecommunications provider or you know someone on the inside. And like I said, this being the phone being the something you have part of the equation. Now, the next iteration was an app-based MFA, which usually utilized push notifications sent to your phone from various providers like Okta or Microsoft. And this works pretty good and protects you against the SIM swapping. On the other hand, though, those push notifications can be annoying, leading to MFA fatigue or user error. Admittedly, I've always wondered how MFA fatigue would actually work. I would assume you would need to target someone as they were working for this to happen, like maybe a session or a tab for the application was open on their computer. Like, why not just turn the phone off or uninstall the app and deal with it the next day at work or something? I know, personally speaking, I've been asked to authenticate while using Microsoft's Azure DevOps. I've opened my laptop with like a VS Code window open to a repo and was forced to auth out of nowhere to Microsoft and gotten random Microsoft sign-in calls when I clicked on the tab. So it's alarming for sure. And I've always made it a habit of just saying no, then going through the entire auth process again, just to be sure that I was doing the work when I wanted to do it and not being tricked. But I could see how some people could just authenticate and accept the notification instinctually. And to counter this, app-based MFA options add a layer of complexity, number matching. Now you would have to match a token or a one-time password to a number on the screen or a prompt asking for it. Now this forced the attackers to try and phish the victims for the information or guess it, which unless you're some sort of like remote viewer, good luck. The newest iteration and the preferred way to do MFA is what is called phishing-resistant MFA. They do this primarily through the use of FIDO, which stands for Fast Identity Online. FIDO is an open authentication standard that leverages public key cryptography to provide security without relying on shared secrets, which can be intercepted or duped. Instead of sending a code that can be phished, FIDO uses a pair of cryptological keys, a private key stored securely on your device, and a public key registered with the online service. YubiKeys are a popular option for this, and I'm not sponsored by YubiKeys or Yubico, but I could be Yubico. I just like them as they're simple and they work well. There's other options as well. But when you attempt to log in, the service sends a challenge that can only be answered by your device's private key, which never leaves your device. By adopting FIDO-compliant authentication methods, organizations add like a layer of security. It's highly resistant to phishing attacks. And in the modern day of cyber threats, where groups like Lapsus exploit every vulnerability, phishing-resistant MFA is becoming a necessity for safeguarding sensitive information like source code repos. But like I said, it's not a silver bullet. If, for example, you bribe the identity provider, that could be an issue. If you're able to steal the YubiKey, it could be an issue as well. Unless it's one of like the biomarker ones, then you're just locked out too, which sucks, but I guess it's not the end of the world. You just need to bother someone or some overworked admin to get access back to your system. Now, speaking of people on the inside, the SIM swapping that Lapsus exploited should be harder than it actually is, in my opinion. And, well, the opinion of the CSRB as well. I'm always intrigued that we have all these know your customer laws for banks and organizations like cryptocurrency exchanges, but in some states you can take over the title of someone's house or clone a SIM or change a SIM to someone else's phone without any of these stringent requirements. I mean, if I have to wait multiple days for money to clear that I transferred from one bank account to another bank account, both of which I've fulfilled the know your customer requirements for, then surely cell phones can wait 24 hours to 48 hours to hold the SIM swapping. You have to take a picture of yourself for Coinbase, for example. Shouldn't this be the same? What about pictures of government IDs or make it a video call requirement? Look, I'm not the biggest fan of putting regulation burdens on companies, but I feel like this is a good place to start. Or allow these companies to get litigated out of business, and I'm sure they'll figure out some methods to prevent it. Like the CSRB states in their report, just adopt measures like the banking industry to start. Now, it's not going to be perfect out of the gate, but we could work towards progress here. Make this an auditable privilege user function and make abuses of this function carry a huge penalty if abused. 5 years in prison isn't worth $20,000 to most people. So yes, I understand. I sound like a hypocrite here. As I've said earlier, that we tend to oversimplify things as silver bullets. Just use MFA. And maybe it is currently the best it can be. I'm able to admit that there may be some Dunning-Kruger effect going on with my lack of telco knowledge and procedures. But on the surface, this doesn't seem difficult as much as changing the norms. I'd love for someone to explain to me why some of these safeguards couldn't be implemented. I have a lot of thoughts on Lapsus, which makes sense considering I did a podcast on them after all. And I want to approach this from the standpoint of a security professional and from the standpoint of being a human being. In some ways, Lapsus was a wake-up call to some of the biggest organizations in the world. Microsoft, Samsung, T-Mobile, they're all household names. NVIDIA is massive as they've been able to generate 120% profits during this AI cryptocurrency boom, which totally makes sense. Then again, this isn't a stock market podcast. Most large organizations commission pen test reports on some interval to have a pen test report of their services, systems, products, etc., etc. Some firewall vendors appear not to do this, but I don't want to throw stones anymore. I have trust issues with these edge devices. But the stated purpose of these reports are to, quote, find their vulnerabilities and fix them, or something along those lines. There's also an element of needing this to close the deal. Let me explain. Every large enterprise company or organization, buyer of software, usually has a chief information officer, chief information security officer, a head of IT, or someone who has thought about security at the organization. During this due diligence of when they buy new equipment, I'm using this term equipment to mean like software and hardware here, they have a list of documents that they want to review from the vendor. Compliance reports, pen test reports, business continuity plans, etc., etc. They all kind of vary, usually depending on how long ago that person took their SysP. Now, some organizations will bump this against internal processes like their risk registers, internal playbooks, other vendor stack, etc., to make sure that this purchase makes sense. This all sounds good and is definitely better than blindly buying from whatever account executive you like more, or if you match horoscopes with them or something. But focusing on these pen test reports can be a little misleading. I want to emphasize that this is a generalized statement and doesn't reflect specific companies' pen test reports. I'm speaking broadly here. I haven't seen everyone's in the world, but some people do them well and some people don't. So don't look into this as a criticism of any company specifically, please. For items like products, these pen test reports are typically looking for bugs in the application or the hardware vulnerabilities. Like you probably don't want to be able to send "please don't auth me" packets to your firewall to bypass the authentication or blindly accept shell commands in the username field of your interface. I guess it doesn't hurt your stock price at the end of the day, but it does make things crappy for those pesky people that pay you money in exchange for a product. Having this type of engagement on a new product or updated product, this is a great idea. It's worth having a dedicated team of people to poke and prod your stuff. Now, as far as broad pen tests on the organization, that's usually where the scope that is narrowly tailored to not disrupt business actions and not bring down mission-critical devices gets in the way. The production environment must stay up. Information security is a necessary evil cost center, a CYA to most MBAs. They aren't generating profits on the Excel spreadsheet, as we talked about earlier. Well, sorry, I'm picking on MBAs again. But roughly two issues can arise. First, it doesn't reflect the limitations of a real-world actor. Lapsus doesn't care about your productive environment, your profits, your 5 nines uptime, or your finance department being able to generate an earnings report. Their profits don't rely on Microsoft hiring them again next year. And I'm not advocating you give full scope to a pen test team as a response. That's a terrible idea. I'm just trying to raise awareness of the limitations in this type of thinking. The map is not always the territory. This is a mental model I use quite often. Shane Parrish from Farnham Street defines it as, quote, "The map of reality is not reality. Even the best maps are imperfect. That's because maps are reductions of what they represent. If a map were to represent the territory with perfect fidelity, it would no longer be a reduction and thus would no longer be useful to us. A map can be a snapshot from a point in time representing something that no longer exists. This is important to keep in mind as we think through problems and seek to make better decisions." End quote. So when you request these reports or commission them, we need to keep in mind that it's not always the best demonstration of a real-world scenario, start to finish. But from step 4 to step 17 in a 25-step process, it's probably good coverage, if that makes sense. Furthermore, over time, services are added to a network, more vendors are brought in or replaced, employee change happens, territories change over time, just as networks. Additionally, there's a level of bias in maps, or in this case, pen testing reports, that needs to be considered. These are humans after all. Each firm is going to have strengths and weaknesses. Consider the cartographer. In the case of a map, if it's being drawn from above, mountains might not make it on the map, thus rendering the mileage or kilometer scale on the side kinda useless for judging time. There's also a lot we could expand on from this, but the last point I want to make is that sometimes the maps can influence the territory as well. I see this all the time, and I'm not saying that I see this from my employer, just to be clear. I'm not trying to disparage anyone here, just I've been in positions to see a good sample size of these throughout the years. Similar to how city planners use maps to dictate urban development, pen testing reports can steer a company's cybersecurity strategy. If a report highlights certain vulnerabilities or recommends specific security measures, a company might focus disproportionately on those areas, potentially neglecting other aspects of security that aren't emphasized in the report. And this can lead to a posture that is shaped by a report rather than the holistic needs of the system. And this is where Lapsus thrived, in my opinion, and the limited scope compared to the actual scope of the environment. There's also the overemphasis on compliance. Just as city planners might prioritize fitting cities in their models to meet aesthetic or functional ideas, companies might focus on aligning their systems with the findings of a pen test report to meet compliance or to tick some boxes. Resource misallocation can arise as well. Companies might allocate resources, time, and attention to areas highlighted by the report, possibly neglecting other critical areas that require attention but weren't flagged as prominent. And then there's also the Gartner effects, which, once again, nothing bad about Gartner here. They're fine. But just sometimes people over rely on their magic quadrants or whatever to purchase products that may not fit their needs, but fit the criteria that Gartner measured. For example, the BAP, the pen testing report, can influence company culture and behavior. If the report suggests that certain practices or tools employees might adopt these without critical evaluation, leading to a culture where security is seen through the lens of what was tested rather than what's actually needed. And my last point on this is being aware of the feedback loop. There's a risk of creating a feedback loop where subsequent pen tests are conducted in a way that confirms the findings or methodologies of the previous reports, rather than independently assessing the current state of security. And this can perpetuate a cycle where the map continues to dictate the territory rather than adapting to the changes in the real security environment. Remember, Lapsus wasn't dropping crazy ODay exploits or anything bananas. They're just brutalizing poor admins, and after a while, they click and accept, or they trick them into thinking it's support, or just people trying to be helpful, or they bribe them. And all of this would be out of scope or possibly borderline illegal, as you could argue that it kept you awake, bothered you during your free time, or made your work environment hostile. Since the company ordered the test, you can make those connections. Second, it relies on security programs being built around users not doing dumb things, which, in my opinion, is not realistic. I don't know the scientific reasoning behind this, but with my decade or so of experience, there's always been one person who is like a moth to a flame with a phishing link. They just want to be helpful, or I don't know, they just can't resist. No amount of phishing training, either abusive or not, will correct this and account for this for everyone. Or you can't just have blanket policies where you tell people opening links or files through emails is prohibited. You need a technical control of that as well if you're serious. And chances are that you're doing more harm than good with policies like that. Sure, you aren't being pwned through your emails, but the world or your company doesn't revolve around you or your team. What may make the job easier for 10 people may make the job harder for 2,000. The loss in productivity isn't worth it for the MBAs running the company after all. Sorry, that's my last MBA joke. Just like these ransomware as a service arsonists push the resiliency and backups to another level, Lapsus force people of large organizations to rethink these security programs. Don't click bad links or insert sketchy USB devices you found in the parking lot isn't as effective as you hoped it would be. Quote, I have MFA, I'm good, is no longer good enough either, which admittedly was a fast turnaround since for years, whenever a breach happened, security professionals always rebutted with, should have just had MFA, or some variation of that argument. Even for silly stuff like a POP service account, which won't have MFA as it's a service, typically speaking. Now it's phishing resistant MFA, or using something like a biomarker technology on a device. Lapsus was the best marketing for MFA and phishing resistant MFA that you could ask for. And there's another point I want to bring up, the demographics and the impacts of these crimes. Most of the members of Lapsus were between the age of 15 and 21, very young individuals some of which had mental health issues. Maybe it's just that I'm a father, and this is something you think about when you hit this stage in life, but I can't help but feel bad that some of these people may have ruined the better part of their lives to some extent over stupid crimes that didn't really hurt anyone. Hurt as in physically injured, kill, or damage someone. I mean, maybe some of the tricked employees were let go, or the insiders should have been, but there's no what we would call violent crime going on here. The doxing and the harassment definitely needs to be punished. I will agree there. I'm probably going to ruffle some feathers here, but stealing the source code of Bing or source code of a video game may have done some impact to the stock price of an organization, but it's not manslaughter, murder, armed robbery, assault. And the swatting stuff is different, as people have been killed and harmed for these actions. So let's table that to a different discussion. I think you should be responsible for the damages done by the police if swatting is your focus. If they kill someone, that's murder for the swatters. They destroy a house, the swatters should be fronted that bill if they are caught. You should make them pay. Now, police departments could do a little due diligence and make sure that the house number is correct, and maybe the caller is in the same country that's reporting the crime. I don't know. This is a hard problem to fix. You could also probably not need to SEAL Team 6 a house, kill the family doodle, or be upset when someone responds defensively to your no-knock warrants. So, for the sake of this argument, let's put all of that on a different bucket. I've gotten close to the third rail in this episode a few times, and I've already forgotten my rubber boots. But back to causing problems for large, profitable organizations and what the repercussions should be. On one hand, we need to discourage people from doing this in the future. But on the other hand, we shouldn't ruin someone's life, career, etc., because they stole an early release of a video game that's still going to be released and by all accounts, still going to make a buttload of money. Or it could be for the source code of Bing, which still exists and is used by, 17 people who haven't changed the default browser of their new Windows computer yet. I mean, personally, I'm a fan of the Sammy Camcar approach. According to Wikipedia, quote, in 2005, Camcar released the Sammy worm, the first publicly released self-propagating cross-site scripting worm onto MySpace. The worm carried a payload that would display the string, quote, but most of all, Sammy is my hero, on a victim's profile and cause the victim to unknowingly send a friend request to Camcar. When a user viewed that profile, they would have the payload planted on their page, and then within 20 hours of its October 4th, 2005 release, over 1 million users had run the payload, making it the fastest spreading virus of all time. The MySpace team temporarily shut down MySpace to fix the problem that allowed the worm to operate. End quote. In response, Camcar was raided by the Secret Service and the newly dubbed Electronic Crimes Task Force, born from the Patriot Act. Obviously, since only terrorists would take down MySpace after all. Jesus. Sammy Camcar entered into a plea bargain where, in exchange for serving no jail time, he was fined $20,000 and ordered to work 720 hours of community service. He also had to serve 3 years of probation, and most importantly, he was banned from the internet for 3 years. I personally like this approach a lot. As Camcar has stated, those 3 years were great for him, as it forced him to go out into meat space and talk with real people, IRL. Plus, community service lets them be part of their community instead of rotting in a jail cell for something nonviolent. Even picking up trash is a better use of their time, in my opinion. Obviously, we need to take into account getting the support needed for the mental health issues as well. But again, giving people long periods of time without a purpose isn't healthy. And in some scenarios, that can make the problem worse or give them more problem. I just feel like there's a much better course of action for these crimes, broadly speaking, than just locking them up, making it difficult for them to use these skill sets in the future. The world is already hard enough for younger people just entering their 20s as it is. Do we really want to force these individuals to use the skill set underground because they can't even get a job at a coffee shop? Like I said, for cases where there are real damages, like swatting, for example, let's look at that through a different lens of justice for those damages. Stealing source code for Bing Maps or showing some stolen videos that could have been used in a dev update, I have a hard time getting on board for jail time. Community service and banned from the internet? Sure, I could get there. 8 years in prison for a late teen, early 20s? I'm out. And I think most others would agree. Then the last part of the equation is figuring out what the root cause is for this type of action. Why are young men, generally speaking, joining these hacking groups? Well, there's definitely an element of disenfranchisement and lack of purpose, coupled with technological skills and the accessibility of knowledge, how to use those skills. It's easier to participate. And this isn't just going to hacking groups. This is pretty much everything. There's also an element of seeking recognition and control, I think. In a society where traditional routes to status and control, like financial success or family leadership, seem out of reach or less valued in some cases, hacking, quote unquote, can provide young men with a sense of power, recognition, and control over their environment. And then the anonymous nature of the internet kind of aids in this. There's also an element of the, quote, crisis of masculinity, end quote, where in some ways the traditional roles of men are being questioned or diminished, leading to an identity crisis for some young males. Joining groups like Lapsus might be seen by these young males as a rebellious action or a redefinition of what masculinity means in the modern world. Maybe it's like a role model issue as well. Or maybe it's at least giving them an outlet to express themselves. And if we don't get this right, there's a slew of concerns that could happen. First, we could be looking at increased cyber threats from these groups. These groups might not have the same level of sophistication as like established cybercrime rings or APTeens, but their audacity and the sheer volume of attempts can still pose significant threats. Western networks aren't the most heavily fortified, and the allure of hacking can be symptomatic of broader issues like mental health problems, loneliness, and social isolation among young people. This can further alienate them from societal norms and support systems, which could make the personal and public health crisis even worse. And the young age of many of these involved in such groups complicates the legal responses. Juvenile laws may offer protections or lighter sentences, but this could also mean that the individuals are not fully held accountable, potentially leading to recidivism or escalation of criminal behavior, like we saw in Lapsus with Arion. And the economic impact of these actions from groups like Lapsus can have significant repercussion, from direct financial losses from the companies to broader effects on consumer trust in digital services. And there's more dynamics as well as like second and third order effects, but I feel like I've got my point across here. And this is getting long enough and feels like a good place to wrap up. Lapsus, although dormant, is still believed to have members or prior members keeping a low profile. Perhaps they've joined another cybercrime gang. I don't think there's been any conclusive reporting on this. The saga Lapsus echoes the Greek myth of Icarus, offering a modern twist on a cautionary tale. Just as Icarus was exhilarated by his newfound freedom his wax wings provided, Lapsus was emboldened by their early successes infiltrating major corporations and government agencies. They didn't just attack small targets, they aimed for the giants, Microsoft, Nvidia, Samsung, soaring higher with each audacious attack, much like Icarus ascending towards the sun. Icarus ignored his father's warnings not to fly too close to the sun, a critical mistake born out of overconfidence, and similarly, Lapsus ignored the inherent risk of their bold tactics. They openly taunted their victims and flaunted their exploits on public platforms like Telegram. Now, this blatant disregard for caution was akin to Icarus's hubris, believing that they were invincible to the consequences that loomed ahead. The inevitable downfall came for both. For Icarus, the sun's heat melted his wax wings, sending him plummeting into the sea. For Lapsus, their overexposure and arrogance led to their unraveling. Law enforcement agencies in Brazil and the United Kingdom arrested several members of the group, as well as the leader being confined to psychiatric care indefinitely. And that's where the episode ends. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or two. I mean it. Like, send them a text message right now. Now, this podcast is organically driven from listeners like you. So please go to intrusionsindepth.com if you would like to hear more about high-profile cyber attacks and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.
Crank the volume here.